All right, hey everybody. This is Dan coming at you with another one of our infamous Get to Know the Analyst video segments that we're doing. So I'm here joined with Aaron Suduiko, of course, and the analyst that we will be getting to know, Mr. Adam. If we could all introduce ourselves, I'll give everybody a 2-minute pitch for who they are and what we're doing here.
Okay, so I'm Adam. I am I guess the history specialist for the site we'll call. I have a master's degree in Viking and medieval Norse studies, got that in 2019, and I'm currently trying to get into a PhD program to continue doing that research. So I primarily do like Scandinavian history, dealing with the Vikings, but also kind of myth, folklore, all of those angles. I really like looking at, how does that history intersect with games? I'm sure we'll come back to that a lot, but that's kind of my big theme I bring into this. And all of my research interests are all in some way like trying to think about history, thinking about historical narrative, and then how do we use that to enhance and inform the ways we should understand game stories.
Yeah, and I mean, I hope that we do come back to it. I would hope talking about a couple of your articles. But I don't know if I know this story. We always have like a segment where we talk about, somebody's backstory or something. I'm not entirely sure. I'm just realizing now how Aaron, you and Adam got connected because
I'm happy to
feel
take
like
the lead on that.
I feel like the three of us have known each other for a long time, but I don't know how it started.
Yeah, this is some fun deep lore of the site, which I don't think we've talked about before. So I love being able to chat about it. I'll also just say, Adam, I'm so psyched to be chatting with you today because after having founded With a Terrible Fate, one of the things that makes it and continues to make it so meaningful to me is just being able to bring in people with diverse backgrounds and interests in gaming and give them the platform and ability to dig into their storytelling in really nuanced and interesting ways. And without doing any disservice to any of our other amazing analysts, I think you really do stand out in my mind as the poster child for that, not least of which because you really were one of the first people to come to us super organically and just immediately resonate in terms of my understanding, okay, this guy is speaking the same language as us. And that was just so cool to see. Dan, for your benefit, and Adam, please feel free to correct or embellish me if I'm forgetting anything, but to the best of my recollection, you reached out over email to talk with me about Xenoblade after my work on Xenoblade. And it was great because we had exactly the kind of exchange that we three still have every day, just talking about Xenoblade for a while. And then I think I was literally on the floor of one of the PAX conventions we were speaking at when I just had this light bulb go off in my head saying, this guy should really be writing stuff for us. He shouldn't just be talking with me in our inbox. And so I shot an email to you being like, hey, would you ever be interested in actually writing some of this stuff yourself? Because it seems dumb to just be talking about it in With a Terrible Fate's inbox. And that really started it all as I remember it.
Yeah, actually, on my side of things, I was actually procrastinating working on a class paper when I first came across one of the I think it was first one of the convention videos that you'd put up, and then the Xenoblade article. And then, if I remember right, we actually I was throwing around my own ideas for a piece on Hollow Knight, which still never actually has gotten written. I really should do that someday. But I was just trying to figure that out. I was just bouncing ideas off you, and then you were like, "Hey, do you want to try and write this for the site?" And eventually moved on, talked about different things. I think that became the Breath of the Wild article, some of the ideas out of that initial conversation. But yeah,
that was
truly the organic experience that just came across the site one day. I was like, these guys seem like they're doing something interesting, and I want to, talk with them more about it.
It's a good pitch, by the way, not to get too meta for this conversation that we're having, but if anyone happens to be watching this and is interested in joining the endeavor, I think I really do love being able to cultivate the platform and the publication as a kind of just forum for this kind of analysis that we all love to do. So no one should feel as if they need to be a stranger and stay away from that. I think what I loved too about that first interaction with you as you moved out of the inbox and onto the site, that has kept me enthralled with the work that you've done for us and just more generally in the years since then, because shockingly it's already been years since you first came on.
3 years. How has it been
Scary,
3 years?
I wish I could tell you. Time is scary. But I loved that first interaction, because when we were first talking about ideas and what would ultimately become your really great article on the role of King Rhoam in Breath of the Wild, and I was learning about your background in history. I don't know if you remember this, but I actually pitched to you this idea of, why don't you write a whole series about the roles of kings in a bunch of different games, which, by the way, I still think you would be more than capable of doing. But you actually very sagely pushed back against that and said, well, this is something I'm really interested in, and then kind of just want to see where it goes down the line. And I love that, because as I was looking back over your articles and body of work to get ready for this, you really have covered such an interesting diversity of things. Like, a lot of people who write about video games, myself included, will just focus on and drill into one thing over the course of many articles, and so you always know what to expect. But as you fittingly kind of talked about in your last article on the church in Final Fantasy VII, really the thing that unifies all of your work, at least as I see it, is just the really interesting method you take in terms of how you look at these games. But you've covered all sorts of things, from kingship in games to plot holes in Fire Emblem, to the intersection of real and imagined history and where the water tastes like wine. Like, it's wild to go back and look at your whole corpus now.
I mean, my whole thought there is basically, I don't particularly like being stuck doing the same sort of project time after time after time, right? However long a project takes, I'm happy to dig into it. If it takes years, that's great. But when it's done, I want to do something else. I want to try something else. I want to see something else interesting. And so, right, the big fear I would have with like the Kingship series, which I agree, right, I want to get around to that eventually and start building that up into a thing. I think it's about time to dig into that again. But my fear with that is, what happens when we see the same tropes starting to show up, right, in new narratives, kind of, but in a lot of ways, really kind of very similar understandings and similarly flawed understandings of what it means to be royalty. I worry that really the ability to say something interesting about each game will start to go down with as it kind of repeats itself. I don't want to be covering the same ground over and over. I want to keep having new conversations.
I love that idea. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And of course, the door is always open for you to still write that series. But I think it speaks to one of the broader aspects that really interests me about your method. And I want to zoom back even further after this, but with regard to how you see the intersection of history and kind of real world applications of history and stories in gaming, right? Because as you just alluded to, you talk about in that very first article that you wrote about King Rhoam and his kingship, how there's this really interesting quasi paradox that goes on where video games make use of real world tropes and just structures of society like kingship, right? Such that understanding those real world structures can illuminate the games. And oftentimes, weirdly enough, like, the real world structures are more articulated than their representations in games, such that it actually makes more sense in your view to look to analogs to the game in the real world in order to understand the work of fiction better, rather than looking at other works of fiction as the contrast class. I think that's super interesting and maybe counterintuitive to some other people who think about either history or gaming or both. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts and your approach there.
Yeah, you summed it up super well, to be honest. Basically, my whole idea is that really games, especially fantasy games, owe such a strong debt to a specific type of history. And I think really most games, in some way or other, really do kind of in some way refer back to real events, real people, even if they don't know that they do. And I think a lot of games don't know that they do, but yet here we are anyway. Whether that's like artistic styles, actual events, characterization, whatever. And so yeah, kind of my high level philosophy for the site is that yeah, let's look at the history around these games, both production history and then the history that they draw on, and look at how that changes the way we think about the stories. In some of my other work, I actually do it the other way around, where I use the games as an entry point to think about how do we understand the history. So I think, right, so I kind of do it both ways, but here on this publication, I'm really trying to keep it focused on game stories and how do we use history to make interesting arguments about these stories. And I think it's been really successful so far, but there's so many layers of just things we can draw on. In some cases, it's as simple as like, well, this art style, right? Using a very impressionistic, like, I don't know, something like Gris, using this really impressionistic watercolor style, and then little bits of references to like Greek statuary and Greek sculpture, and how are all of those things coming in to enhance our understanding of the game? Another article idea that's just kind of in the ether to eventually show up, because there's something really beautiful about that game, and the architecture and artistic styles around it, I think, end up referencing history in ways that it doesn't fully understand that it references. So same vein, still trying to do the same sort of thing there, but yeah, really, I I mean, some of our other analysts do similar things with folklore and mythologies, uh, but I think doing in history is something that, yeah, is kind of my specialty on the site, and one that really, I think there's a lot more to be said and done around it.
Well, what I really like about your work is that, and we've talked about this before, I think in like a podcast, or it might have just been like a phone call. I don't remember what context we talked about it in, but you know, I like that you have a particular approach to how you write your articles. And one of the things that I really like is that your focus on a particular aspect of a game uh, is so interesting, because you kind of like you focus on it, and then you think, well, wait a minute, why is this strange, or why does this stand out? And then you give us the context for why it does from a historical perspective, in a way that I think you said earlier, like sometimes the games don't even know that they're doing that. And what I love is that when it's something like that, where the game doesn't quite, maybe they didn't think about why they put like a very specific kind of church in Final Fantasy VII, right? You kind of hone in on something like that and think, wait a minute, okay, let's kind of spider web this out and go in a bunch of different directions. And what it ends up doing is enhancing my understanding, not just of uh, the game or the history that you're referencing, but my understanding of how I interacted with the game in the first place. Because to quote like another to quote a famous YouTube critic, there's a lot of things that you may not notice, but your brain does. And I think that you do a really great job of kind of teasing out, why does this stick out to us? Why is King Rhoam so iconic in this game? Why is there all of this apocalyptic imagery in Final Fantasy VII? What is the deal with that church? It's things like that that I really you have such good hooks with your articles, and I always love talking to you about them, because I feel like every conversation we have is and another thing.
And another thing, there's so
Yeah.
much of that I love it.
Yeah.
I mean, that to be honest is my favorite part of both the writing process and just getting to hang out with the other analysts and with you guys on the site, is everyone always has, oh, and another thing.
Mhm.
And even like you guys notice things that I don't. But through kind of everyone bouncing ideas off each other and everyone having their own little bit of specialization, really some of my best work. I think the Apocalypse article is my best work. And Dan, like, I need to just shout out you again, because if you hadn't pointed out the layers of just Buddhist imagery in Midgar. Like, I was missing a big part, that it was through talking with you that it just showed up.
Well, that I'm glad you brought that up, because that Facebook conversation between you and I is one of my favorite conversations I've ever had on the site, because we were both like feeding into each other's excitement the entire time.
Yep.
So yeah, that was really great to see come to fruition too, and just see your takes on not just that, but all the other imagery that you go over. I mean, it's funny because I think that one of the things that we run into a lot, or maybe people who do similar work to us run into, is that kind of frustrating, like, oh, the English teacher says it's this, but the author just meant that the curtains were blue. You know, it doesn't actually mean anything. It's like, well, okay, but it could mean a lot. And I think that what I love about all of your articles, but I would agree, especially that apocalypse article. There's something about it where when you lay everything out like that, it really is hard to ignore that reading that you have.
Yeah.
And I just I love that kind of structure that you give to your articles. So yeah, it's I always get jazzed when we're talking. So
Yeah, and also on that vein, one of my focuses on the site, I think, is less making, not always the best interpretation, or certainly never the only interpretation, but I'd much rather make an interesting argument that is in some way flawed, or not quite complete, or really has points that don't work in its favor, in order to further the conversation in an interesting way, to get people asking the right questions rather than being necessarily 100% right. Certainly, there's effort to do good faith work and to try and address things correctly, not just
yeah,
willfully do stuff. But I get things wrong all the time. Great example of that is in the church article. A commenter on the article actually very kindly pointed out that the church is actually not what I identified it as. It's not a Romanesque church. It's a Romanesque revival church, which is a style that emerges in the late 18th century in Germany mostly. And so is kind of the stereotypical German Lutheran church, is this Romanesque revival.
but how would you have, that conversation, I guarantee you, is not being had anywhere else.
Exactly, right?
Right.
And thinking further, right, I still haven't figured out quite how that changes the argument I made. I think it does in subtle ways, not big ones, but very subtle ways. But how is the extra layers of history building on each other? But yeah, right, no one would care if I hadn't made the argument in the first place that this really is important. And so, right, there's a really lovely conversation that comes out of it, and that makes even the slightly erroneous argument super worthwhile.
Right.
I love that
That's
too,
what I love about
because
it.
I think it speaks really nicely to this philosophy you have of arguments and analyses as a mode of communication, rather than just like some artifact that is to be, discovered and taken at face value and then discarded, right? Like, as you so nicely point out, like, one of the great impacts of that article is people discussing it and moving the conversation about the game forward by virtue of, questioning and taking issue with certain aspects of the article, right? And that's something that I think many other people would wrongly see as a flaw of what's being created, whereas it's actually one of the greatest virtues of it, right? I love that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because there are just so many paths we could go down, especially with the church article, since it's the one you just wrote. But before we get into more of the details, one other thing that I'm really interested in about your general method, and while I have you here live on camera, I can finally ask it and get my answer. But you talk about it and you speak really eloquently in that church article about how part of your method and where it kind of begins and ends is this notion of recognizing something in the game as weird and trying to understand it, right? And I would just love to get more of your take, to the extent that you've reflected on this, about exactly how that process starts for you. And I'll tell you why. For me, for instance, right, I feel like I have a similar explanatory urge, but that it comes about differently because like many of my articles start from a point of confusion where like I'll encounter something in a game, especially oftentimes the ending that doesn't seem to make sense or be consonant with the rest of the game at face value. Like, oh, I don't get why Ni no Kuni ended the way it did. Oh, this ending to Xenoblade seems like it totally came out of left field, right? And that for me, like begins the mode of exploration and trying to understand, well, okay, giving the authors the benefit of the doubt though, how might we explain this such that it fits with the rest of the story? And that becomes the entry point for analysis, right? So for you, beyond the idea of recognizing something as weird, what do you see as your entry points into recognizing something as deserving analysis or needing it?
Sure. And another example of that, why does Necron just exist in Final Fantasy IX?
Exactly.
Another great example of that. But yeah, so I mean, I think our ideas are not as far off as you necessarily suggest, because right, something just doesn't fit is ultimately right. That is something weird, and if that's the final boss, just coming at literally 23rd hour descent from the heavens to try and destroy the world, right? That's weird. That makes no sense with all the stakes that are built up so far within the narrative, we think. Right, on the conscious level, the plot as it's been presented, that doesn't make sense. But I definitely look kind of at all levels. So I think to get in that, I think probably comes from my academic training. Since I work with a lot of pre-modern materials, one of my PhD applications is to do a kind of eco-historical, so looking at environment, human interactions in one 14th century manuscript. Now, this manuscript doesn't have any texts that are talking about the environment. There's not a geographic description of Iceland. There's not anything like that. So I'm having to pull things on a very granular level, pull things out of the text that the text doesn't necessarily care about, right? And so I've just got a lot of training in spotting what are the throwaway lines, what are the mentions that, despite not being the point or the main thrust, nevertheless have a lot of significance and are telling us something about the culture or about the game story. It's kind of like the same cognate, right? If it's the medieval stories narrative or the culture that produced this story or our culture or the game story, all kind of the same sphere. And so, right, I've gotten really good at just spotting that. So like the King Rhoam article, the one that stood out to me was right at the tutorial, he talks about being ashamed of a failure. And I was like, wait, I mean, obviously the failure is just failing to stop Ganon. And also kind of being a jerk to Zelda. But what else is this failure, right? This is a really weird reaction for someone who, by all accounts, did his best, or some version of his best, acted in good faith, tried really hard, and was overcome. Right? Isn't that really all anyone could ask for? And then pulling from there and trying to just see how we can solve that puzzle by drawing in as wide of a net as you can. Because turns out, working with pre-modern materials, you have 7 manuscripts and a piece of string, and you must construct an entire culture out of it. So
you got to kind of read between the lines a little bit.
Exactly. Got to read broadly, be able to read really broadly to draw a bunch of influences together in a meaningful way, and then read really closely to make sure that you're actually have the threads to tie the whole thing together. And so kind of walking back and forth within the text of a game.
Yeah.
Between thinking broadly on a really zoomed out structural level and on a really granular level of what exactly is going on here.
I think what I really love about that is not only what you've teased out in the articles that you've written for the site, but the mentality behind that is so refreshing to me, because I have always been a proponent of like there's a certain kind of internet critique or internet deep dive on things where the person doing the critique or the analysis assumes this level of like I know what this story should have been, or I know what should have happened here. And so when something weird like that pops up, they're like, this is stupid. Why is this here? Right? They see it as a flaw of the story. Whereas your method is more like, well, wait a minute, it's in there for some reason, right?
Yeah.
Why don't we take it on its own face value and see what it might be trying to allude to, right? And I love that mentality because the other one kind of drives me nuts.
Exactly. And sometimes the answer is truly just right. They overshot. They missed their mark. Right. The story they were trying to tell and the story they told aren't quite the same story. Those don't get turned into articles. There is definitely a case of a little bit of survivorship bias here, where the ones that turn into articles are the ones where there is something really interesting to draw on. And the ones that haven't yet, or I've started and then kind of abandoned, are the ones where, well, no, there isn't actually enough here. Really. There either isn't enough here, or the stuff that there is doesn't form an actual image, right? It's just noise. There's something, but it's all just noise. And so, like right now, the very first proposal I had with the Hollow Knight article that has never happened, I'm thinking about, what's up with the King's brand? How does that make you a king? What are you actually doing there? At this point, it's still just noise. I've been thinking about it for 3.5 years on and off, and it still is just noise. There's something, I can see that there's something, but that image is not in focus enough to be able to make an argument out of it.
I would argue that the fact that you've been thinking about it for 3.5 years, that to me is at least that's more than a lot of people will give something that they find as being weird or silly.
Yeah.
So to give an example that I know Aaron and I share, we still at least twice a year talk about Final Fantasy XIII. At some point, we'll say something about it, but for now, it's all noise.
Yeah.
So, yep. But we've been talking about it for going on 10 years now.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
I
don't want to think about that.
even if the game never turns into an article, right? Even if we never solve the problem.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I just love so much about games. And one thing, like going forward with the site, I just want to do more of. I think right where I'm at right now, the thing I want with more articles on the site is working with people. And even if those conversations are inconclusive or flawed, or we're just like, we don't know where to go, I want to have those conversations where people can see it and have them with like everyone else who has ever worked on the site in some way or another, and just see what new comes up. Because right, we all have our own ways, but new things come up every time we talk that we have never thought about before, and I love that.
And I think that's some of the fun of the article writing too. And what I really like about your work is that I think we come back to articles like we have different opinions, or we have something else we want to say about a game all the time. So I think that there is this drive to kind of have the definitive word on something, or to kind of close the book on an idea. But that's not always the case. I mean, Aaron's written, response articles to his own work. The canon series changed very much, and I think that your articles are just so inherently, hey, look at all this stuff I found. Here's what I think it is. What about you guys? And I love that about it so much. So yeah, I would love to see, if you poll around the site and see like, hey, what kind of brain bugs are you guys dealing with? What kind of game ideas been kicking around your head for years? I would love that.
I've still got that one about Golden Sun I mentioned, I think, on the podcast last time. Right. Yep. That's another one that is still just noise, but I'm going back to that game soon. And so I just want to really try and figure out, what happened. Or, Persona does the same thing. What's up with having this set of stuff?
Right.
It's a JRPG. It's just like a high fantasy JRPG. It's got all this mythological stuff that's on some level filler, but what if it's not filler?
Right.
And you just figure out how is it and how is it not filler?
Are the Arcana, is it just JoJo? Is it all JoJo?
Yes.
Shut up, Dan. No one wants to hear about JoJo.
I will never shut up.
But also, yes, it is just JoJo.
But it is just no, but that's what I love about. I mean, I think what I love about what we do, broadly speaking, and why I just Aaron and I have talked off mic about how excited I get about people who we we don't know in person, who we just know through the site, and how easy it is to talk about these ideas that we just talk about all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that I love about the site so much, is that this is all just like a second language to us. So having you kind of come in with the Rhoam article, the Apocalypse article, and then the Church article, and just kind of write in a way that I think speaks to the people who read it, but also the other people on the site, is just a very cool thing to have. So I'm a big fan of the honing in on a weird thing and branching out to find out what we're talking about.
I love the urge too of co-authored analysis coming from especially someone like you who's so self-consciously concerned with method. Interestingly, the same kind of conversation and theme came up when we talked with Lauren on our Meet the Analyst podcast or video or whatever you want to call it with her. So I think it's definitely a felt urge. It's interesting to me because I think one thing that we have definitely spoken more about in these later years of the site's history is how we really do feel as though we're undertaking not only the act of analysis, but also a project and method, right? I mean, I feel really strongly that we are trying to build a better way to read games, and that it's thanks to the amazing work of people like you that we're all able to do that collaboratively. But maybe one of the cool things that we're ready for now in terms of methodological maturity is moving beyond that method that we've gotten pretty good at doing in a single player format, right? And doing more of a co-op analysis. Right? Well, no, but really, and I'll tell you one thing that you bring up that makes me really excited about that is you talk about these various ideas that will seem like just noise as opposed to signal. And I find myself wondering, sitting here and hearing you talk about that, well, for at least some of those ideas, might it not be the case that having another player plugged into your analytical apparatus and talking through it with them might be the additional kind of vector required to turn that into signal versus noise?
Yeah, I mean, I super agree. I guess one way to think about it is that, right, I've got one line here, and we really need to be triangulating in order to really hone in on anything here. And yeah, whether that's whether you phrase that as co-op or just any of a myriad of other ways, I think that same urge, I think, is just super impactful of just the act of talking to someone. And I think partially this is born out of just 2020 and the isolation of a global pandemic, is right, the urge to just talk to people and really have meaningful conversations about these media that we've been all consuming a lot more of recently, I think, even more so than usual,
Yep.
is just a really compelling urge. And I think, yeah, I agree. I think the site's at a place where we know everyone kind of knows their niche and has their own methodology that's really mature enough to run into other methodologies and grow instead of breaking apart.
I love
I
that.
totally agree.
Adam, I wanted to ask you a question to probe a little bit more about your diversity of interests and how you see them as interrelated. And as with any good question, I'm going to introduce it by quoting yourself to you. In your most recent article about the church in Final Fantasy VII, which everyone should read if they haven't already because it is exceptional, you have this really great footnote when you are talking in the main text of the article about various possible histories of Midgar that might be endorsed or implied by your analysis on the church, right? Which itself is an interesting methodological project and something worth digging into more. But I want to look at this footnote because you make this observation very much with your historian hat on, saying history is not a single set narrative of things that happened in capitals, right? But is instead a best guess network of interpretations. And that's doubly true for a history of a fictional place. I loved that sentiment, especially as someone who is not a historian, has never even been, good in a history class, let alone professionally trained such as you. But it invited me to think about what seems pretty intuitive, which is the idea that there is an aspect of narrative that is common both to fictional worlds and to real world history, right? Because both are just in some ways about telling a story based on a battery of data, right? And so I wanted to just try to explore more, given that you have such interests and background in both history and gaming, how do you see the two as related? And maybe in particular, since you focus so much on video games as opposed to other modes of storytelling, is there anything that you think about the specific interactive mode of storytelling in video games that make them particularly apt for shedding light on the narratives of history or vice versa?
Yeah, so I'll answer kind of the second half of the question first, as to why games specifically. I mean, I do think games, in a way that other media doesn't, really offer something interesting, whether you're trying to access, how do we think about our own past, or how does historical method inform a game? And that's that games really don't have the opportunity to leave things to the imagination. That they can, and especially on a narrative level, really good games often do with just fragments. Like, I mean, the classic example here is Dark Souls. Their info boxes really creating the sense of something really big that isn't actually there. But at the same time, it is audiovisual and interactive. And so, the sounds of the world have to physically exist, and the look of the world has to physically exist. And we have to be given tools to alter the world and to really become an agent in the narrative and in the implied ongoing history of this world. And so, a game throws in a ruin section. Well, there is a past there. Things you don't build something to be ruined, except that the game developers did, right? I mean, in a very real sense, that's exactly what happened, is that someone built that game or built that level to be a ruin. And yet, in universe, that doesn't make sense. And so, right, there's an implication going on of a past. But the other big thing that changes is, right, there has to be people who interact with you in the world. In a game's world, NPCs have behavior, enemies have behavior in a way that in a movie they don't necessarily do, right? Like, your extras can be doing XYZ thing in a scene, but there's nothing emergent about that. You don't learn about what's important to them, what their responses are, beyond what is very carefully shaped. And so going into making a game, there's just a different set of concerns going on, and ones that I think better reflect how past people and how, like, historical agents had to interact. Because there is a sense of daily life. There is a sense of, well, how are they existing in this world space? In Skyrim, you've got your shopkeeper going around with having a few artifacts, magic items exist. Who's selling them to them? What's the networks of behavior? And yet something can come in and steal that, and they react in a certain way that is not really comparable to anything else. And so, really, game designers more than anyone else have to build cultures and really generate a world with a past that has led up to this moment, more so than even the great works of literature that are doing that. I mean, Lord of the Rings is the example, and yet, is Azeroth a more fleshed out world than Middle Earth? Probably.
That I feel like that's an article. Is
Oh
that
God,
more
I'm
fleshed
not
out than Middle
I'm
Earth?
not a World of Warcraft player, but if someone else wants to tag team on that one, I'm happy to.
I think you're looking at the guy who would do that.
Yeah, right. Well, I love that, what you just said about, nobody builds something to be a ruin unless you're a game designer. That's such a great, microcosm of, like, what it is that you're exploring with, like, the idea of this out of place church being, at the base of Midgar, right? It's what your article, explores is, well, okay, here's the history of that, but also let's think about what the shorthand they're using is, right? Because you just explained that the fact that there's a church there says way more about the culture of Midgar, like Aaron had alluded to your section about like all these different possible histories. And it's like the fact that that's there, if that weren't there, we would conceive of Midgar and the slums very differently.
Super differently.
Right. So it's this, these historical images are these really impressive shorthand like tools for game designers to use.
And I think shorthand is exactly the right word, and a really important word to like the first half of the question you had asked, Aaron, where like, history is way deeper and way weirder than anything any game can really do, both in entering mindsets and in the raw events. And so there's a lot of stuff that has to get compressed into shorthands, into these big symbols that have to do a lot of heavy lifting. And so recognizing the symbols for what they are works in both directions as a really powerful lens. At least I found, right? That's kind of my whole method is, right, these historical things imply a history within the world, but they also imply something about how we should think as people who live in the real world. What shorthand are the designers looking towards? Not necessarily fully intentionally, but still. And there are shorthands that they don't intend that show up in them. But there's a lot of compression that's going on that makes it super interesting. And actually, I think that's a place I differ from you, and certainly Aaron, but I think from a lot of people on the site, is that I do often think in terms of what is the story that is trying to be told as at least one valuable level for the analysis, right? Where we think about, oh, the curtains might just be blue. And so like author intention being a thing. And, when I'm thinking within the world space, the author intention doesn't matter. Shorthands organically emerge and have meaning. But at the same time, there is a deliberateness that I really like exploring, and really as a highlight to the craft of the narrative as something that is constructed and that says a lot about how we think about stories and the ways in which certain landscapes and certain historical elements fit within those stories.
I think it's so interesting to me to hear you say that, though, Adam. And I'm gonna make a glasses metaphor here just because you're wearing them, so it can be hilariously apt. I think you have bifocals in a really interesting way, because I think maybe even from where I sit, it's almost in part because of your historical proclivities and background that you're able to recognize and see through the lens of authorial intent, but then also take it off and look at things just as they are, right? Because you're right, no doubt you have an appreciation for what authors were trying to do, but also in all of the articles on the site that you've published, you have this incredible ability to what you accurately describe in your church article as a mode of excavation or archaeology, right? Just see things as they are, regardless of how they might have been intended, and analyze them on those terms as a historian would. Right. And so I think it's just a tremendous boon both to you and your readers that you're able to adjudicate both of those things and do something like in the methodological aspect of that church article, as not only oscillating between those two lenses, but also pointing out in a way that I think many gamers and even game analysts don't often think about. Hey, if you're thinking about authorial intent, this is the right place in the analysis to introduce it. You can't just throw it in there whenever. Like, this is a stepwise function and there is a place for it. This is that place. Otherwise, there are different tools that are appropriate, and here's how you can use those. And I love that.
Yeah. I'm all about those toolkits. Like, thinking about stories and thinking about game stories and game worlds really is just a whole lot of different tools. And I think certainly something I try to do in each article is using the tool that seems interesting and then matching that into the right game and the right question to where that tool really maximizes its potential. And that's something I want to keep doing, because there's a whole lot of methods of thinking about games that I haven't even are just like vague ideas right now on just how differently I could approach it and what new things would come up with that. I don't know right now, but I want to find out.
And I love that, because that's something that I kind of see it happening more largely like on YouTube with deeper analyses going on. But I remember the thing I remember most from film school was that, and actually from my my brief stint as an English major too, the different critical lenses through which we can view something.
Yeah.
There's different methodologies. There's the feminist critique, there's the Marxist critique, all this stuff that we throw around in academia. And it's kind of being done with video games now. But I think that the toolkit for video games, like you're saying, is a lot broader, because there's so much that goes into a video game. There's so many different aspects through which you could examine it. So I just love how rich the analysis through a historical lens is on, any of these topics that you've written about.
Yeah.
And I hope that, we just keep finding more and cooler ways to do it.
Right. I mean, I don't think my analysis gets at the truth or the answer any more so than someone who does, animation analysis, right? Just thinks about how do you characterize people through animations, or someone who really focuses on environment stuff, though I do that too. I'm working for a different project. I'm working on a whole thing on just snowy environments and their historical associations with Vikings in video games, right? That's a video that is sitting next to me on my other monitor, staring at me, waiting for me to edit. But I don't get at the truth any more than anyone else, or Aaron, you using all sorts of philosophical frameworks as your lens for Plato or in Xenoblade, or Layla's work on truly folkloristics and the methods of thinking about folklore with a game entity. But we all get at a truth. And I love the idea that there's finally a sphere that is starting to really each figure out their own methodologies for each critical lens. And it's not just us, but we are, this site is, I think, a forerunner in that. We were ahead of the curve. And everyone else has finally caught up to us, where there's a lot of really fun work on a lot of different aspects of games. And I really think the next step is what happens when those spheres, little microcosms of analysis, start bumping into each other, and what new sparks start flying.
You do a great job of that, though, by the way, and I am going to get on my soapbox to make sure you're not selling yourself short, because of course you have your lens of the historical perspective, and that is one interpretive lens, and you obviously own and wield that with incredible dexterity, as anyone who's read your work knows. But I think you also are a great guide for taking and applying other theoretical frameworks and introducing your readership to those, right? Whether that's as you mentioned with your apocalypticism article, religious frameworks that you wouldn't have been able to apply without the help of people like Dan, or frankly, the Fire Emblem plot hole article, which was kind of like an application of my perspective on gaming, and Xenoblade and others, even to, and what I think is most certainly most current, but also kind of interesting in the sense that I've been mulling it ever since I read this church article of yours, the application of, you know, this theory that objects can have agency, which is something that, you know, comes up in other fields of study, but which I think has really interesting and subtle implications for something like a video game, where agency is so specially central just by virtue of the player's role in the game, right? So to be able to say like, well, let's take that theory and apply it to the church and think about the church as a character, that's so interesting. And that's not really history as such. That's just another way of like, of thinking about games. And I'm going to really selfishly now ask you to just talk a little bit more about this idea of objects as agents, because I think it definitely merits more consideration and further exploration.
Yeah, I think the easiest way to illustrate, honestly, the idea of object agency is in video games, because like Transistor, the sword is sentient. The sword is a character that sasses you all the time. Borderlands does the same thing in some of its weaponry, being literally sentient, talking, making jokes, screwing you over deliberately because it can. And stories come out of those moments. So these are literally objects that were made that you find in the world that have agency. But you can kind of take that same principle and apply that to things that don't actually talk to you. And so, you know, oh yeah, so the gun in Borderlands that laughs maniacally as you shoot chickens at people is clearly an agent, that an agent of chaos, but an agent. What about the gun that doesn't do that? Is it less of an agent for not laughing maniacally? But it still fundamentally shapes the way that you interact with the world, what positions you take when you're shooting, what, like if you got a sniper rifle, you're playing differently than if you have an SMG. And so the object is telling you how you play. Zoom it out again. So it's now, think not in terms of inventory, but in, okay, in Skyrim, you're going up the hall to like the Jarl's Longhouse in Whiterun, and you have to climb through all this space. And so suddenly, right, it's telling you something and telling you how you should act towards Jarl Balgruf when you actually meet him, because he's literally on top of the whole thing. Or you turn that on its head and you have the challenge of punch him and then run away down through Whiterun. But the routes you can take through that are dictated to you by the objects, by the houses, by the NPCs, but also the random fountain in the center of the courtyard. And the stairs, whether you jump over them or try to run down them, and how do you evade the guards. All of that dictates how you play. And so you can frame that in terms of them being agents in their own right, right? The player isn't the one making the decisions. The decisions available are just being told to you by the objects. And so suddenly, right, on a very emergent level, the stories you are telling within this game space, what specific route you take through the field of all possible stories, is in some ways defined by what objects you have, what objects you are using, and in their use and the human interaction with them, they act on the people. So, right, so games end up being this brilliant lens for this anthropological framework. This is one that I learned in one of my archaeology classes. Right, when I first heard it in context of archaeology, I was like, well, this is weird because the object agency just refers back to the people that are using the object. And yeah, that's kind of the point. But it really asks the fun question of, right, what actions are being dictated by the things we are using. And honestly, you could almost do this on a meta level with something of, right, thinking about the same games with keyboard and mouse versus controller versus something else, right? What tools are being given to us as equipment to interact with the world?
Right.
And how does that change what stories we are being told?
This is something that you and I may want to explore in another like famous Facebook conversation. But have you ever heard of the Japanese practice kuyo?
Is this the like repairing broken stuff one?
No, so
Or is
that's
this a different one?
kintsugi. This
Okay.
kuyo is it's a religious practice where the Japanese will take an object and they'll basically give it a funerary rite at like a Shinto shrine. And it's anything, right? It's like a toothbrush sometimes. It's basically showing sort of gratitude and respect for this thing that you had a very personal connection with. And I really like the idea of us doing a co-op article
Yes.
about the kuyo
Heck
of
yes.
objects in video games.
Absolutely. Because like
Yeah.
we've all done that, right? There's
Mhm.
the
Why do we
piece of
save
inventory.
items until
Or
the final boss?
exactly. Or
Right.
you know, Fire Emblem gives this, if you don't think of like the characters as just like objects that you can interact with, so many people will stick with their growth units, the people that they've played with since the beginning, instead of using the objectively better ones that they get halfway through.
Or parties in JRPGs, right?
Yeah.
Like
You have your party, and it is yours, and they shall pry from your cold dead hands.
right. Yeah, I would
And
love to go into that with you. I
yeah,
think that'd be a lot of fun.
absolutely.
Yep. See, this is with a terrible fate, ladies and gentlemen.
Exactly. This is exactly what I am here for.
Yeah. I love that so much. I wish we had 3 more hours to go into the object agency idea.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about it for hours too. I love, Adam, you also call to mind like the armor and weapons in Dark Souls 3. I think of immediately, right? Like the Soul of Cinder armor, right? Like you use the analogy of heirlooms in your article on the church,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, you put that armor on your avatar and you can like feel the weight of everyone who kindled the fire before you, even though it's just like a digital representation of an object that your avatar is wearing, right? And armor skills, not armor skills, weapon skills, like the special skills of like the Abyss Watcher's sword, right? Like being able to define and articulate your available options by virtue of like that object's memory and experience. Like, oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
I love that.
Even the one that we might be overlooking because of how obvious it is, or dancing around because it will spark another hour conversation. But the Buster Sword,
yeah,
in Final Fantasy,
the,
I mean,
the
that's
boss absolutely. Yeah. That is the premier example.
It is, right? Yeah, that's
right,
the one. Yeah.
Right. If I didn't write the article about the church, I was going to write the article about the Buster Sword because it is so dang iconic. Mm-hmm. As this totally impractical, ludicrous chunk of metal that in the original game really doesn't have significance, or rather, by the time it has significance, players are either really attached to it or they threw it in the trash long ago.
Right.
No middle ground in the original game.
Important to note, the title screen is just the sword.
It's just the sword. Even in the base game, the title screen is just the sword, isn't it?
Yep, that's right. So I love this. We could write like 8 articles about. I love it.
Adam, at the risk of actually keeping you here for like 5 more hours, I know you alluded at the beginning to the other venues in which you explore the intersection of history and gaming, where you don't approach them in the same ways as you do on the site. So maybe we could round you out with what some of your other projects are and how you distinguish them from what you do on With a Terrible Fate.
Yeah, sure. So I think the first one to mention is that, right, the history and games thing is something on a very professional level that I'm deeply interested in, because one of the PhD proposals I have out and I'm waiting to hear back from at this point is looking at like the specifically Norse undead that's usually called like Draugr. As bad of a name as that is for a variety of reasons, it's very specific like medieval historian annoyance there. But right, that specific enemy name, basically just the name in some cases, being imported as suitable to a specific moment of historical game or a specific type of story. And literally one of my proposals is like, how do we understand in the present day the Norse Middle Ages, the Vikings and their descendants and their ancestors, through studying these beings in Skyrim and God of War and Assassin's Creed Valhalla, right? And so, right, on a very professional level, on very nuanced historical cultural studies, video games play a role in that. But also, I have a YouTube channel and I live stream on Twitch. And basically, I'm doing the mirror image of what I do for this publication. And so instead of looking at games stories primarily, it's looking at game design as a window into the cultural understandings of the largely medieval, but really all time periods past. And so, right, very recently, right, every week I've been streaming Assassin's Creed Valhalla for a very long time now. I'm almost done, thank goodness. But you see weird things, like, how do we imagine a druidic cult? And who do we imagine that with? What deities are we imagining that with? How badly wrong is that imagination? What sorts of aesthetics and images and sacrificial temples and like nature vibes are going on in there? And it can get really, really incoherent if we're taking it as a window into the history, but that tells us really something about what feels appropriate and how our modern culture is this active reception. We've been receiving a mix of scholarly interpretations, popular cultural interpretations, and medieval texts, translations, bad translations, fan fiction around those, reinterpretation, borrowing into other media, this whole network of writing and creation for hundreds of years that's coalescing in a specific way, into any given iteration of a text. Each game does it slightly differently. Each game sometimes does it radically differently. And so you were accessing these points of this huge cultural historical understanding through an individual game and through breaking down its design and then using that to get into the history. So, as I said, literally the mirror, instead of using the history to enlighten how we should think about the game, it's using the game as a window into this much broader understanding of history and memory, popular memory, and the past.
Do you know what you're going to be streaming next yet?
I mean, I've got another month left of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which, by the way, I suppose I should plug the thing. Cross promotions. Twitch.tv/Ludohistory. So literally like history by game. But after that, I think I'm doing some board games where I want to just take a month in May and do board games. And I'm also going to do Golden Sun there, a game I mentioned earlier in this recording. That's going to be soon. A lot of kind of the old favorites are coming up again because I've always liked vaguely history-y games. But like, I don't know, last week we just did Crusader Kings 3 because the first DLC dropped for that. And then, yeah, I've got board games coming up. Some really cool history-themed board games. I want to just partially just play with friends, but partially also think about, how does the game interact with the history it's themed around?
Adam, do you follow Magic the Gathering at all? I don't remember.
Not too much, but I do know that they did just release like a new pack that's very loosely Norse themed.
I would have been shocked if I were the first person to mention that to you, but I had to make sure you knew about it.
Yeah, like there's a few that are super obvious, right? Like there's one that's just the Norse world squirrel Ratatoskr under a different name. But then there's some ones that are clearly like drawing on Warhammers, like almost like Lich King aesthetic, far more than any history.
Yeah, they do that. Magic is a fun mix of, I think I know what you're doing here, and where's this coming from?
Yep. Yep.
Well, Adam, I know we could talk for hours and hours. So in the spirit
and we will again.
And we will, yes.
Absolutely.
On future videos and future podcasts. So this is certainly not the end, but for the sake of our audience and each other's time, perhaps a nice note on which to end. And you've hinted at this over the course of our conversation, but what topics or games or areas are you most excited about diving into in future upcoming articles on the site?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't have any ideas that I am incredibly eager to jump into right this second. There's some ideas kind of in the background, some that I've talked about, with like Golden Sun's whole mess of just mythological stuff, and how do we imbue those with narrative significance, or uh, still trying to figure out that Hollow Knight one that I mentioned, the original really for the site. But there's some other ideas I'm not quite ready to reveal yet, because I still need to sit down, play the game, that I think has something interesting, and make sure that it actually has some meat on there to try and sort out. But as I said, like, I think the thing I'm most excited for in the near future, though, is to try and start doing some collaborations. Like, when I know you guys will eventually get around to like introducing Layla, but I really want to work with her on some stuff, because I want to work with Hugh Dan on some of this stuff, right?
Absolutely.
Just the ideas we threw around today. I want to not lose those threads, and try and keep those rolling into early summer. But yeah, I think that's what we're looking at. Probably early summer. Keep an eye out for the next project from me.
Excellent. Can't wait.
I love the sound of that. Well, Adam, again, I mean, always a pleasure to see you, man, and always so
same.
grateful to have your time. Watchers, listeners, anyone who might have found this, if you haven't already, check out this amazing guy's work on With a Terrible Fate, on Ludohistory, on Twitch, and here on YouTube. And I'm sure we'll be chatting again real soon, guys, and meeting some of our other analysts in the future. But for now, Adam, Dan, thank you so much, my friends.
And thanks so much for having me on.
Anytime.
Always. Cheers.